Hey everyone, Elizabeth here. The Last Laugh delivers stories that leave you speechless. If you're here for it, hit subscribe and let's go.
The night my father called me the family disappointment in front of 200 people, I was wearing the same watch that had closed my first nine-figure deal. He didn't know that, of course. That was always the point. The Meridian Grand's ballroom was exactly the kind of place my brother Marcus loved. High ceilings, imported marble chandeliers that cost more per fixture than most people's cars. It was his annual shareholder gala for Carter Holdings, the logistics and supply chain empire he'd built over 11 years. Or so everyone believed. The invitations had gone out on cream cardstock with gold embossing. The guest list included 3 city council members, 1 state senator, and a food critic who'd written a piece about the catering. Marcus had sent me mine 3 days before the event, almost as an afterthought. My name was spelled wrong on the envelope. Renata, not Renita. He's made that mistake my entire life. I came anyway. Always came. Not from sentimentality, that ship had sailed a long time ago, but because these events were, in a technical sense, my business. When you hold 73% of a company's voting shares, the annual shareholder gala is a professional obligation. I wore navy. I smiled at people I recognized. I accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server and found a quiet corner near the east wall where I could watch the room without performing for it. That's something people in my position learn to do, watch. My father found me 20 minutes in. Gerald Carter was 68 years old, silver-haired, and still moved through a room like he owned it, which technically he no longer did. He'd transferred operational control of Carter Holdings to Marcus 7 years ago in what the family called a legacy decision, and what I privately called the first of many mistakes. Dad had been a competent businessman in his time. He'd built a regional trucking company from a single leased vehicle and 2 contracts. What he'd never learned, what neither he nor Marcus had ever bothered to learn, was how capital actually worked. Not revenue. Not profit margins. Capital. Who holds it, why it moves, and what happens when it stops. He stopped beside me and looked me over in the way he always did, like he was taking inventory of everything I was failing to be. Renata. He said it the right way at least. You look well. Thank you, Dad. So do you. He accepted a glass of wine from a server and surveyed the room with visible pride. Marcus was across the ballroom holding court with the senator and 2 men I recognized as distribution partners from the Midwest. He was in his element. He always had been. Charming, loud, comfortable, taking up space. I'd spent a long time believing those things were the same as competence. Big night for your brother, Dad said. It is. He's done something real with this company. He let a small pause sit there, deliberate. We're proud of him. We. Not I. Always we, as if my mother were standing beside him agreeing, as if the family were a unified body and I were slightly outside it. Mom had died 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. She'd been the one person in my family who'd ever asked me about my work with genuine curiosity rather than polite obligation. I still kept a photograph of her on the credenza in my office. Some griefs you carry differently than others. That's good, I said. He should be proud. Dad looked at me. Something shifted in his expression. That particular mixture of disappointment and indulgence he'd worn toward me since I was about 16 years old and had apparently failed to become the daughter he'd imagined. You know, he said just loudly enough for the 2 couples standing nearby to hear, Marcus has always understood how the real world operates. Some people, he didn't gesture at me, he didn't have to, never quite get that. One of the couples glanced over. The woman's expression was carefully neutral. Her husband looked away. I nodded. I love you, Renata, you know that. But you've never understood how real money works. He said it the way people say things they believe are kindnesses. Gently, like a correction rather than a wound. That's not a criticism. Just an observation. I appreciate your candor, I said. Marcus appeared at that moment with the timing he'd always had for scenes he could enjoy. He slung an arm around our father's shoulders and grinned at me. The woman of the hour, he said, and he meant our father, not me. It was a joke. He made it every year. Renata was just asking about the business, Dad said, which I hadn't been. Marcus's grin didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker of something between pity and condescension that he'd never quite learned to hide. Renata asking about business. That's new. The couple nearby laughed. softly, uncertain whether they were supposed to. She's never understood the first thing about how real money works, Dad said again, apparently pleased enough with the line to repeat it. Embarrassing, honestly. Marcus raised his glass in a small toast. Just smile and look pretty, sis. Leave the board meetings to us. The table nearby laughed more openly now. I checked my watch. It was 8:47 p.m. I smiled, accepted a canopy from a passing server and let the moment go. I had learned a long time ago that there is a difference between restraint and weakness. My father had always read my silence as the latter. He was not the first person to make that mistake, and I had stopped needing to correct it. What none of them knew was that in approximately 60 hours, the information they were laughing about would look very different. I grew up in the Carter house on Pemberton Drive, the second of 2 children and, by every unspoken family metric, the lesser one. Marcus was 3 years older, louder, and, from the time he was about 12, the obvious inheritor of whatever legacy our father imagined he was building. He was good at the things that registered as good in our household. Sports, confidence, the ability to walk into a room and make people feel like they'd been waiting for him. I was good at math. This was not, in our family, considered a personality. I read financial statements for pleasure at 14. I tracked commodity prices through high school not because anyone told me to but because I found the patterns genuinely fascinating, the way some people find crossword puzzles or chess. I applied to the finance program at Whitmore University and got in on a full academic scholarship, which my father acknowledged by saying Marcus had almost applied there once. I graduated summa cum laude, which my father acknowledged by asking if I'd met anyone nice at school. I had, actually. Her name was Dr. Priya Nair, and she wasn't a romantic interest. She was my thesis advisor, and she was the first person who had ever looked at how my mind worked and said without qualification that it was exceptional. She'd spent 20 years in private equity before moving into academia, and she had the particular quality of intelligence that recognizes itself in others. She introduced me to 3 of her former colleagues. One of them offered me a position at Vanguard Capital Partners before I'd graduated. I took it. I spent the next 8 years learning, at a level of depth most people never access, how capital actually moves through the world. Not the textbook version, the real version. Private placements, silent partnerships, holding structures, beneficial ownership arrangements designed to be technically visible to regulators while remaining practically invisible to everyone else. I was good at it. Exceptionally good. By 29, I was managing a $400 million portfolio. By 32, I was a partner. By 34, I had launched my own vehicle, Ardent Capital Group, a private investment firm that operated almost entirely out of public view. The invisibility was intentional. In my industry, noise is expensive. The people who talk loudly about their deals are generally not the ones closing the ones that matter. I'd watched enough careers implode under the weight of their own publicity to understand that the most durable kind of power was the kind nobody was looking for. Marcus launched Carter Holdings the same year I launched Ardent. His timing was good. Logistics infrastructure was in a growth phase. E-commerce was creating supply chain demand faster than regional operators could meet it. And Marcus had inherited enough of our father's operational instincts to build something real. Within 3 years he had 12 contracts and 40 employees. Within 5 he was regional. Within 7 he was looking at a valuation that made his early investors very happy. The problem was capital structure. Marcus was a builder, not a financial architect. He was brilliant at operations, at relationships, at the kind of deal-making that happens over dinner rather than in term sheets. But he had structured Carter Holdings in a way that left it chronically vulnerable. He'd taken on too much debt relative to equity, his investor base was fragmented and restless. And by year 6 he had a liquidity problem he was managing with a combination of charm and short-term credit facilities that were going to expire badly. I watched this from a careful distance. I tracked the company's public filings. I spoke obliquely with 2 of his early investors who I happened to know through Ardent's network. And then I made a decision that I have thought about many times since. Not with regret exactly, but with the particular weight that comes from choices that change everything. I arranged, through a series of holding entities that were legitimate, compliant, and completely opaque to anyone not reading the filings very carefully, to become Carter Holdings' largest investor. The first tranche was $34 million, structured as a convertible note with a governance clause. By the time Marcus negotiated his Series B, I held instruments that, upon conversion, would give me 73% of voting shares. He didn't know. His attorneys had reviewed the documents. His CFO had signed off. Nobody had thought to trace the beneficial ownership of the holding entity through to its source. Marcus would have been appalled. That was part of why I'd done it the way I'd done it. But only part. The other part, and I've been honest with myself about this because you have to be, was that I loved my brother. Not easily, not without grief, but genuinely. Carter Holdings was a good business being run into the ground by structural negligence, and I had watched enough companies die that way to feel something close to protective fury at the thought of it happening to his. The $127 million I'd ultimately invested wasn't charity. It was capital deployed with an expected return. But it was also, in ways I didn't fully articulate even to myself, a rescue operation conducted by someone who wasn't allowed to be known as the rescuer. The condition I'd set quietly in the governance structure. As long as Carter Holdings was healthy and growing, the voting rights remained dormant. I collected returns. I filed disclosures that were technically visible and practically unread. I let Marcus run his company. I let my family believe I was the disappointment. For 4 years that had been the arrangement. The Monday after the gala, I had breakfast with my attorney, James Okafor, at a place near his office that served excellent Ethiopian coffee and tolerated long conversations. James had been my legal architect for 6 years. Patient, meticulous, deeply uncomfortable with drama, and the person I trusted most with the parts of my professional life that couldn't be discussed in open rooms. "You're sure?" he said. It wasn't a question exactly. "I'm sure." He set down his cup. "Once I file the governance notice, there's no quiet version of this." "I know. Marcus will. I know what Marcus will do." I looked out the window. It was a gray morning, the kind that sits on a city like a held breath. File the notice. Initiate the withdrawal from the operating facility. And I want the board formally notified of the ownership structure before Marcus is told. In that order. James looked at me for a moment. He'd known me long enough to know I didn't make moves like this without having carried them for a long time first. "What happened?" "My father called me embarrassing in front of 200 people. Boss. He's done that before." "He has," I agreed. But I checked my watch at 8:47 and I thought, that's enough now. That's the number. James nodded slowly. He didn't try to argue me out of it or interrogate the decision further. That was one of the things I valued most about him. "Tuesday morning," he said. "Tuesday morning." Tuesday at 9:14 a.m. I called James from my office. A clean, quiet space on the 14th floor of a building that did not have my name on it anywhere, and said 4 words, "Initiate the withdrawal notice." At 9:18 a.m., the board chairman of Carter Holdings, a man named Franklin Dubose who had been on the board for 3 years and had never, to my knowledge, had a difficult day in his professional life, received a formal notification identifying Ardent Capital Group's beneficial owner, the governance clause, and the shareholders' intention to exercise voting rights in connection with a material capital event. At 9:22 a.m. Franklin Dubose called Marcus. I know this because Marcus called me at 9:31 a.m., and his voice had a quality I had never heard in it before. A stripped-down, airless quality, like something had been taken out of the room. I let it go to voicemail. He called again at 9:34. And 9:41. And 9:47. I listened to the first voicemail while I worked through my morning correspondence. His voice moved through confusion, then calculation, then something I recognized as the early stage of panic. He said my name 4 times. He said, "What is this?" twice. He said near the end, "Call me back, please." And the please was so uncharacteristic that I stayed with it for a moment before deleting the message. He arrived at my office at 11:30 a.m. I'd told Diane, my executive assistant, to let him up. Some conversations needed to happen in person. He came in looking like he'd aged 3 years since Saturday. His jacket was on but his tie was loosened and his hair, which he usually kept very deliberate, was slightly wrong, like he'd run a hand through it and not looked in a mirror since. He stood in the doorway of my office for a moment, taking in the room, the view, the framed Ardent Capital registration on the wall that he'd apparently never had reason to look at before. "Sit down, Marcus," I said. "This is..." He stopped. Started again. "This can't be real. Would you like to see the filings?" He sat. I turned my monitor so he could see it and walked him through the ownership structure with the same tone I would use in any board meeting. Clear, unhurried, thorough. The holding entities. The conversion schedule. The governance clause. The $127 million in deployed capital and the dormant voting rights that had, as of this morning, been formally activated. He didn't speak for a long time. You've been my investor, he said finally, for 4 years. Yes. You saved the company. I made a capital allocation I believed in. He looked at me. Something moved across his face that I couldn't fully read. Grief maybe, or something adjacent to it. Why didn't you tell me? Because you would have refused. A silence. He knew that was true. Dad would have talked you out of it, I continued. And the company would have failed within 18 months. The debt facility was going to collapse the operating structure. You needed equity, not more debt, and you weren't going to accept equity from me because... I stopped. Let the because sit without finishing it. Marcus finished it quietly. Because we didn't think you knew what you were doing. Yes. He put his elbows on his knees and looked at the floor. What happens now? That depends on you. He looked up. I'm not here to destroy Carter Holdings, I said. I never was. I'm here because the company I own 73% of is being run by someone who still doesn't understand his own capital structure. And that's a liability I'm no longer willing to carry silently. I leaned forward slightly. I want an operational review. A new CFO from a shortlist I'll provide. A revised debt structure. And I want a seat on the board, in my own name, not through a holding entity. And if I say no? Then I exercise voting rights, replace the board, and appoint management. Which I'd rather not do. I built Carter Holdings as much as you did, Marcus. I just did it from a direction you couldn't see. He was quiet for a long moment. You were at the gala Saturday, he said. I was. And Dad said. Yes. Another silence. Longer this time. I'm sorry, he said. He said it the way people say things they aren't entirely sure they deserve to say. Quietly, without theater, with just enough weight to suggest it was real. For Saturday. For a lot of Saturdays. I studied him. My brother, who had smirked at me across a ballroom 41 hours ago and told me to smile and look pretty. My brother, who had never once in 36 years asked what I actually did. I know, I said. Is that enough? I don't know yet. The board meeting happened on Thursday. Franklin Dubose had spent 2 days moving through the stages of institutional panic. Emergency calls with outside counsel, a consultation with a crisis communications firm, a careful review of the governance documents that confirmed, repeatedly, that everything was entirely in order and there was nothing to contest. He arrived at the meeting looking like a man who had slept approximately 3 hours and drunk approximately 14 cups of coffee. The other board members, 3 of them, all appointed during the period when Marcus controlled the governance structure, arrived in varying states of bewilderment. They knew my name. They didn't know me. I came with James and with Sasha Petrov, my CO at Ardent, who had the particular quality of being both extremely calm and extremely precise in ways that tended to make rooms feel like they were being organized around her without anyone quite knowing how. I presented the ownership structure. I presented the operational review findings. Sasha had spent 48 hours pulling apart Carter Holdings' financials, and what she'd found was both better than I'd feared and worse than it needed to be. I presented the proposed CFO candidates and the revised debt structure. I presented the board seat formalization. Marcus sat across from me and said almost nothing. He voted yes on every resolution. At the end of the meeting, Franklin Dubose shook my hand with the careful formality of a man recalibrating an entire worldview in real time. Miss Carter, he said. We look forward to working with you. Thank you, Franklin, I said. I've been a stakeholder for 4 years. It's good to finally be in the room. My father called me that evening. I answered this time. He didn't say anything for a moment after I picked up. I could hear him breathing. A sound I knew from childhood, from the moments before difficult conversations that he never quite found the words for. Marcus told me, he said. I assumed he would. Another silence. I didn't know. No. All this time you were. He stopped. Why didn't you tell us? I thought about how to answer that. I thought about the Saturday evenings at the dinner table where my father had talked about Marcus's company with a pride that was physical, visible, that took up space in the room. I thought about every Christmas where the conversation about my work had lasted approximately 90 seconds before. Pivoting back to something Marcus had done. I thought about standing in a ballroom 200 people strong while my father called me embarrassing and the nearby tables laughed. Because it wasn't information you were asking for, I said. The silence after that lasted a long time. I've made mistakes with you, he said finally. It came out rough, like something being moved that hadn't been touched in years. Yes. I don't know how to, he stopped again. Gerald Carter, who moved through rooms like he owned them, who had an opinion on every subject and delivered it with the confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to, did not, apparently, have a prepared remark for this moment. You don't have to know how to write now, I said. You can just know. He said my name. My whole name correctly, Renata. And then he didn't say anything else. We stayed on the phone for another minute, maybe two, without speaking. Then I told him I had an early call in the morning and said goodnight. I sat in my apartment after I hung up and looked at the photograph of my mother on the side table. Not the one from the credenza at work, a different one from a trip we'd taken together to Portugal the year before she was diagnosed. She's laughing in it, her head turned slightly away from the camera, like she's laughing at something just outside the frame. I've always found that detail important somehow. That the thing making her laugh isn't visible. That you have to imagine it. I thought about what she would have said about all of this. Not about the money, not about the board seat or the governance clause or the $127 million. About the gala. About standing in that ballroom in my navy blazer, checking my watch while my father performed his disappointment for an audience. I thought she would have said, "You didn't need to wait as long as you did." And I thought she would have been right, and also that I couldn't fully explain why I had. Except that somewhere in the years of building and watching and staying silent, I had confused strategy with suffering, and told myself the patience was professional when some of it was something older and less clean than that. 3 weeks after the board meeting, I hired Elena Vasquez as Carter Holdings' new CFO. She came from a background in logistics sector restructuring and had the specific skill set the company needed. Not growth management but stabilization. The distinction mattered. Marcus had been managing Carter Holdings like a company in perpetual expansion mode. What it actually needed was 2 years of consolidating what it had before it could safely grow again. Elena understood this immediately. She and Marcus developed a working relationship I hadn't anticipated. Contentious, direct, and apparently productive. Within a month she had restructured the primary debt facility and identified 3 cost centers that were hemorrhaging quietly. Within 6 weeks, the company's operating margin had improved by 4 points. Marcus called me after the monthly review to tell me about it. He called me, specifically me, not just the board, and he led with the numbers and then asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. I said yes. We had coffee on a Wednesday at a place neither of us had been to before. It was awkward in the particular way that things are awkward when 2 people are attempting to have a relationship they don't have a template for. We talked about the company for a while and then we talked about other things. A documentary he'd watched, a trip I was considering, the fact that our father had started seeing a woman from his golf club named Patricia who made excellent lemon cake and called him Gerald in a way that seemed to be doing him some good. It wasn't reconciliation exactly. I wasn't sure it was going to become that or whether I wanted it to. What it was a beginning of something different. And for now that felt like enough. At Ardent Capital, the quarter following the Carter Holdings restructuring was, by measurable standards, one of our strongest. Sasha had identified 2 new portfolio opportunities in the supply chain sector that the Carter work had surfaced. I'd been asked to speak at a private equity summit in London that I'd declined twice before and finally agreed to attend. I had lunch every other Thursday with Priya Nair, who had moved back to the city 2 years ago and who remained, without effort or ceremony, the person who understood best how I worked and why. I told her about the gala over lunch 2 months after it happened. She listened without interrupting. She had that quality, the ability to be fully present with difficult things without trying to resolve them prematurely. When I finished, she said, "How do you feel?" "I don't know," I said. Which was honest. "Do you feel like you won?" I thought about it. About my father's voice on the phone that evening, rough and uncertain. About Marcus across the board table voting yes. About the photograph of my mother laughing at something outside the frame. "I feel like I made something true that was already true," I said. "Whether that's winning, I'm not sure." Priya nodded. "Maybe it doesn't need to be." That felt right. Not clean. Nothing about it was clean, but right in the way that honest things often are. The last thing I'll say about this is something I've thought about more than any of the numbers, more than the governance clause or the board seat or the 4 minutes between my attorney's call and my brother's panic. There's a version of this story where I walked into that gala and said something. Where I corrected the record in front of the senator and the food critic and the 200 people in their black tie and their borrowed certainty. Where I made my father understand publicly the dimensions of what he'd been dismissing. I chose not to. Not because I was afraid. Not because I was protecting anyone. But because the version where they found out through the mechanisms of the thing itself, through a governance notice, through a board filing, through the careful architecture of documentation that my industry runs on, felt more accurate. More true to how power actually works versus how people imagine it does. The family disappointment. I've sat with that phrase. I've turned it over. What I've concluded is this. Disappointment requires expectation. And the expectations my family held for me were, from the beginning, smaller than what I was. That's not a condemnation of them. People can only see what they've taught themselves to look for. But I was always there. Doing the work. Holding the shares. Checking my watch.